Welcome to the Intro to Answering Skep course. I'm Rex Evans, and in this lesson, I'm going to be covering some of the basics of skepticism. So, what is skepticism? Broadly, skepticism refers to an argument that questions our ability to derive moral obligations. Obviously, it has the term skeptic in it, which is generally being questioning, and so in this particular case, it's often questioning our ability to derive moral obligations, because that's generally the obligation that is relevant to the resolution. So there are three main types of skepticism that I'll cover in more detail in the following slides. So the first is moral. So this questions specifically our ability to derive normative obligations. Second is linguistic, which often says that language is indeterminate and language cannot be used to derive moral obligations. And then finally is epistemic skepticism, which is skepticism about our ability to have knowledge, which would include moral knowledge. So it's our skepticism about our ability to come to conclusions about moral knowledge. So why does skepticism negate? So there are three main ways that it negates. So the first is just directly disproving the resolution. So most LD resolutions are normative statements, which means that they prescribe some course of action and have some sort of obligation. So for example, the word ought implies a moral obligation. Similarly, the word should is normative because it's saying that a certain actor has an obligation, although most LD resolutions use ought. So the skep debater will argue that by disproving the ought claim, i.e. by disproving that there's a moral obligation to do the resolution, that disproves the resolution directly. The second way in which skep debaters will claim that it negates is that it triggers presumption. So they'll say that because it's impossible to generate moral obligations, it means that neither side has any offense, and so the judge should just presume negative. The third is permissibility. So they would argue that skepticism implies that the resolution would merely be permissible and not obligatory. So this is kind of similar to the first argument, in that it's saying that because anything is permissible according to skepticism and we can never have any moral obligations, that means the resolution is also permissible and not obligatory, and then we'll argue that permissibility negates. So moral skepticism. So this says that it's impossible to effectively derive moral obligations. There are a variety of different arguments for this. However, the most common example is probably the Derrida card, which I'll briefly explain the warrant of it. So the Derrida card kind of says that justice requires acting immediately in the face of injustice, and you can't really delay justice, otherwise you would be perpetuating an injustice. However, any sort of moral decision requires deliberation. You can't just, automatically, immediately make the correct decision. Instead, you have to kind of think about, what is the correct thing to do in this instance? What could be the potential consequences? Who is in the right in the situation? What is actually the just thing to do? And so given that morality kind of requires that deliberation about what the right thing to do is, that means that it's not possible to kind of act with the necessary justice because you can never make a moral decision immediately without any prior deliberation, which would make moral obligations inherently contradictory. And so they'll argue that that implies that moral skepticism is true. The next type of skepticism is linguistic skepticism. So this is skepticism about the ability of language to command some sort of normative force. So the argument is generally that language is indeterminate and cannot be used to generate obligations. So for example, there's a common Kripke card that is read, or an argument from Kripke, that says that language has no true meaning outside of a community that generates it. Our understanding of what different concepts are and what they mean and imply do not have any sort of independent meaning. Rather, it's only given meaning through our understanding within a community, which means those concepts don't have any kind of prior or a priori force. And then this would imply that morality is not something that can be binding, because morality only makes sense within a specific community that gives its language meaning, but doesn't have any commanding or obligating force. And so this would negate, according to the skep debater, because it shows that language cannot command normative force. The final type of skepticism that I'll discuss is epistemic skepticism. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. So basically, how do we know what we know? How do we come to conclusions about the world? How are we able to verify knowledge? These are all questions of epistemology. And so epistemic skepticism says that this project of epistemology is basically impossible. It's impossible to know anything. We can't confirm or verify anything about our existence or about knowledge. And that would negate, because moral knowledge is a subset of the broader category of knowledge. So if knowledge is impossible, that would imply that moral knowledge is also impossible. A common example of this is external world skepticism, which is the argument that it's impossible to verify the existence of the external world. And so people will commonly read a Searle card for this that says that, for example, there's no way of knowing whether or not we could be deceived by an evil demon, and all of our kind of sensory perceptions are actually the opposite, or we could just be brains in a vat, or like Matrix style, not truly existing, and there's no way to verify whether or not that is the case, or verify that the world actually exists, which means anything that we think is knowledge could be an illusion, and that would trigger a form of skepticism. So hopefully this is a good introduction to some of the basic forms of skepticism. Thank you for watching.